Hello there, I'm Amira David. This is Boom Bust, and these are the stories we are tracking for you today. The fear of a default for Greece is at an all-time high as officials express major pessimism that a deal between Athens and its creditors can be reached. Meanwhile, Greek Finance Minister Yanis Varoufakis is in Washington, D.C. today. Our very own Ed Harrison is on standby with the details. Then John Brynjolfsson is on the show. He'll tell me why economic growth in Europe has been so anemic and whether negative interest rates are doing enough to help the situation. Plus, in today's big deal, Miss Erin A joins me from our New York studio to talk about mega airliner Delta cutting down on its international flights, all despite a $1.2 billion profit for Q1. What exactly is going on here? We'll answer that question and so many more in today's show. So let's get it started. Greece could come up short on cash next week. That's if it can't reach a deal with the eurozone on economic reforms that would unlock essential bailout funds. Both the Greek government and its creditors have said they need to reach an outline agreement at the very least by their next meeting on April 24th. But Greece has yet to produce a plan for reforms deemed acceptable, and it's making European officials awfully pessimistic about the chances that a deal can be reached. That includes German Finance Minister Wolfgang Schäuble, who yesterday told the Council on Foreign Relations in New York that expectations for a deal are extremely low. He said no one has a clue how we can reach an agreement on an ambitious program. He also said that Greece's new leftist government had destroyed all economic improvements that were made by Athens since 2011. Without securing that additional financial assistance, Greece says it may not have the cash to make the payments it owes to its creditors for the month of May. Meanwhile, credit ratings agency Standard & Poor's has downgraded Greece's rating one level to CCC plus with a negative outlook. It's a move that suggests the likelihood of a Greek default has increased. So although it's the outcome that nobody wants, the more a deal gets delayed, the higher the risk for default goes. Greece has been front and center right here in Washington, D.C., with the annual spring meetings for the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund in full swing. Joining in that mix is Greek Finance Minister Yanis Varoufakis. He spoke before the Brookings Institution today, as did the German Finance Minister. Our very own Edward Harrison was there throughout all of it, and he's bringing us the latest details. Ed, as I mentioned, both of them spoke. What did they have to say? Was there any common ground?
There was no common ground from what I could see. I think that the common ground that there was is that they had mutual respect for one another. Wolfgang Schäuble said that specifically that Yanis Varoufakis, he had a good personal relationship with him. It's just that they obviously had a very different political agenda. But in terms of their actual talking points on what they could accomplish in terms of how they even see from a framework perspective the situation between Greece and its international creditors, there was just no overlap there whatsoever. And so, as Schäuble was saying earlier, it's going to make it very difficult to reach any sort of agreement in the near term, given how wide the gulf is on what is achievable and what they actually want to achieve.
What's the primary difference, would you say, between what they were communicating in their vision?
I think the primary difference is that Schäuble wanted Greece to live up to the letter of its agreements based upon the 3 or 4 different planks for Europe, and that is to make sure that the government deficit or that the government's debt doesn't grow more than receipts, They wanted to make sure that there were structural reforms, and there were 2 or 3 other things that he mentioned specifically. But none of these things pointed to the humanitarian crisis that Yanis Varoufakis is talking about. And moreover, when Schäuble was asked specifically by the Brookings Institution about the fact that they could borrow at negative interest rates and whether or not doing so in order to engage in productive capital investment was a wise idea, Schäuble dismissed that out of hand and called this too simplistic a question and said that really he did not want to have more debt. So it was clear to me that the key for Schäuble is debt loads need to go down irrespective of what you do. That's true for Greece as well as it is for Germany.
It seems like for Greece, this is a much more personal thing that they're dealing with, whereas for Germany, this is about getting finances in order. Well, if they don't come to an agreement, then what's next? What is Greece expected to do?
Well, it was interesting. David Wessel, who is of the Brookings Institution, he asked that specific question. He says, let's just say, that, the scenario that you're painting, Mr. Varoufakis, doesn't actually pan out and that the creditors don't come to the table, because Yanis was very optimistic that eventually they will get to a deal. And what the Yanis Varoufakis said in response to that was, quote, we will compromise and we will compromise and we will compromise, but we will not be compromised. That was a specific, quote into a question. And what that basically means is that he's saying, without saying it explicitly, that they will default if they do not get an agreement that they can reach that will not compromise them as a party, as a government for what they were elected to for a mandate. Then they're left with no alternative but to default.
And it does seem like it's a game of chicken to a certain extent, who's going to cave first. But what is the prospect of a real Grexit here? It's been highly speculated in the news. If you look at all the headlines, everything is just Grexit, Grexit, Grexit. So is this going to happen, do you think?
I don't think it will happen. I think that basically what's happening behind the scenes is that both sides are preparing themselves for the potential default that I was just talking about. It's in their best interest to do so, even if they're not thinking about it. Publicly, Yanis Varoufakis will say that, I'm very optimistic and we're going to go with plan A. But at this point in time, you have to have a plan B, and I'm sure that they do have a plan B because that's the reasonable thing to do. And that would be to default, but within the eurozone. Both Schäuble and Varoufakis said that Grexit was just off the table. And so that means that the only thing that's politically advantageous is to have a default within the eurozone. Greece can say we did everything that we could, but they wouldn't budge. Germany can say we did everything we could on our side, but they wouldn't budge. And there you go.
Oh, very interesting. And we'll find out what happens very soon. It's a very fast moving situation. Ed Harrison, our very own Ed Harrison, thank you so much for that reporting. Okay, to get his insight into what's going on in Europe, John Brynjolfsson is on the show. John is a CIO of Armored Wolf. I first asked John if Europe can sustain the triple-digit debt loads in Spain, Italy, Belgium, and Portugal, given its anemic growth. Take a look at what he had to say.
Well, yeah, I mean, the European continent has been, in the doldrums, not just since the financial crisis, but following the financial crisis for half a decade, based on the, the flawed model of European integration. Having said that, the very aggressive monetary actions and the depreciation of the currency has, in recent weeks, ignited some signs of optimism, but by and large speaking, those are from very low levels, very anemic levels. We still have, except in Germany, extremely high unemployment rates, extremely high debt-to-GDP ratios, and structural problems. The fear is that the little bit of growth we're seeing, which I guess we're quantifying as about 1.25% real GDP growth across the continent, with some divergence in terms of the stronger versus weaker economies, sadly may simply postpone the structural reforms that are needed.
And what about negative interest rates in Europe? Even Belgium can borrow at negative rates out to 5 years. Doesn't that change the calculus for investors and policymakers?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the negative interest rates are largely a function of the ECB, its backing by Germany, and the idea that government bonds, that certainly within the core and even to most of the periphery, are in effect, guaranteed by the strongest nations within the continent, and those negative interest rates are barely stimulating investment and growth throughout the continent. So yeah, the negative interest rates are part of the stimulus package. The fiscal stimulus is somewhat constrained by the Growth and Stability Pact. There's some violations of that in France, where France is running larger budget deficits than 3% as prescribed by the Growth and Stability Pact. But the negative interest rates is the stimulus that we're alluding to. The weaker currency is the stimulus we're alluding to, and it is only those macroeconomic stimuluses that are keeping the continent afloat, while, as I suggested, keeping the continent afloat is actually forestalling the structural reforms of the labor market and the entitlement system that I think ultimately is needed in order to create a vigorous economic zone.
Absolutely. Well, taking a specific look at Greece, Greek officials have said that if they had to choose between a default to the IMF or a default to their own people, they would choose the IMF. But could the Greek people stand to lose more if they do default to the IMF?
Well, my congressman, at least during my youth, some 20 to 50 years ago, was Tip O'Neill from Massachusetts, and he, his quote was, "All politics is local." I don't know if he was the first person to say that or the last person to say that, but yeah, obviously all politics is local, and what that means is that the Greek politics, and Greece, at least for the time being, is a sovereign nation, is going to be governed by local politics, so they have to serve the local populace. The local populace is somewhat, facing a dilemma. Do they want to stay part of the eurozone and be burdened with kind of this huge debt overhang and the tax implications, the tax both in a literal sense as well as in a figurative sense of that of those obligations, or do they want to cut themselves free? And over the past 6 months, Russia has kind of thrown them a lifeline in terms of saying, we'd be happy to work with you, and even the Obama administration has thrown them a lifeline by saying that the austerity and the debt repayments are what you could call it whatever, undemocratic.
All right, time now for a quick break, but stick around because when we return, we'll talk all about the demand for oil. Rick Rule will tell us what he thinks about the claim that demand could rise by 1.1 million barrels a day this year. And in today's Big Deal, Aaron Aid and I are discussing airline giant Delta. The company announced that they're planning to cut back on international flights by 3%, despite the fact that it's posting huge profits. So the question here is why? The answer is coming up, so stay tuned. And as we go to break, here are the closing numbers at the bell.
Thank you, Mr. President. What is the state of Black America?
Like the rest of America, Black America in the aggregate is better off now than it was when I came into office.
Please somebody help us, cause you can see I'm feeling helpless, and all them babies in them shelters. Man, we can't change the hand they dealt us. Help us, help us.
People of America, when are you going to wake up? This is all a setup.
We as the United States are supposed to stand for something.
It's easy to talk the talk, but do you walk the walk?
This former frogman is looking at you.
We're a frightened society today who turns to our government and says, make us safe.
Who's the real Wizard of Oz behind the curtain? Stay vigilant and question more. Question more.
If you want to know what's going on in your city and your streets, never back down like Tyrell, and the truth is what you seek. To analyze, investigate from the bottom to the top. You speak your mind like Sean Stone, whether they like it or not. I got Tabitha, Miss Wallace, with the wisdom and the pearls. Between the outrage and the evidence, what's going on in this world?
Watching the Hawks, watching the Hawks, watching the Hawks. Listen when they talk.
Welcome back to the show. Now it's time for a quick news roundup with the one and only Bianca. Bianca, nice to see you.
You too.
Okay, tell us what's the latest with earnings today.
Lots of news coming out of Citigroup and my favorite company ever, Netflix. Okay. So we're going to start off with that first. On the earnings front, Citigroup reported a 16% increase in quarterly profits on Thursday. The third largest U.S. bank beat analyst expectations after cutting costs down to $403 million in the first quarter, down from $1.16 billion a year earlier. And even though Netflix subscriptions are growing, the company missed on analyst expectations after reporting 38 cents per share instead of 63 cents per share. Netflix blamed their numbers on foreign currency exchange and claimed their earnings would have been at 70 cents per share otherwise. Former Fed Chairman Ben Bernanke is keeping the revolving door between Wall Street and Washington alive, landing a new job with one of Wall Street's largest hedge funds. He'll be joining Citadel, run by billionaire Kenneth Griffin, as a senior advisor, offering his analysis on global economic and financial issues. And the protester who glitter-bombed ECB President Mario Draghi has been identified as Josephine Witt. Witt disrupted Draghi's press conference in Frankfurt on Wednesday, chanting "End the ECB dictatorship," before being removed by security. She told Bloomberg she protested the meeting because Draghi was not democratically elected and for the ECB's role in the financial crisis. Those are some of the major financial stories affecting your world today.
I have to say, Bianca, those pictures were just absolutely incredible of the girl getting carried out. I love that she was still posing for the cameras as she was being taken out. She was working the cameras. It's like she was a pro, like she's done it before. I guess something to take notes for if I ever want to stage a protest myself. All right, thanks, Bianca. Appreciate it. On Wednesday, oil prices jumped close to the highest levels they've been in over a month. Many see this as a result of the International Energy Agency's upbeat note about rising demand. The agency said that oil demand would rise by 1.1 million barrels a day this year. To get his take on this, Rick Rule is on the show. Rick is the CEO of U.S. Sprott Holdings Incorporated. Aaron first asked Rick if he agrees with the IEA's claim, and here's what he had to say.
I don't. I've watched IEA data for 20, 25 years, and like most forecasters, their near-term track record is almost unblemished by success. I do think that the oil price was oversold, and I think that there are other reasons to ascribe to a near-term strength in oil, but I would caution your listeners not to pay too much attention to near-term moves in the oil and gas market. They're very bad predictors of longer-term pricing.
Why is that? Can you talk to me a little bit further about that?
Well, ultimately, markets work. And, you know, the truth is that the cure for high prices is high prices, and the cure for low prices is low prices. For a decade, we had high prices, which stimulated supply and decreased demand. It will take 3 or 4 years for that market imbalance to run itself out. And near-term fluctuations that have to do with much smaller market forces can sometimes lead investors and other people to misinterpret the nature of the move that's indicated by near-term data.
Now, Rick, 1.1 million barrels a day this year would be a notable acceleration from last year's 700,000 barrels a day growth. So where is that demand coming from?
I think one thing is it's coming from lower prices. There is more utility to energy users. People are less inclined to avoid filling their cars. The truth is that high oil prices, high gasoline prices diminish the utility of the commodity to consumers, and lower gasoline and lower oil prices increase the utility. Of course, if something is more beneficial to you and cheaper, you use more of it. That's just a normal response to a market created by lower energy prices. Exactly what one would expect.
So how is supply going to develop to meet this demand?
That's a very interesting question. You know, just as the cure for high prices, as we have seen in the last year, was high prices, the cure for low prices is low prices, and you address that one of two ways. Demand creation, which lower prices in and of themselves help stimulate, but probably more importantly, in supply destruction. We are seeing a dramatic decrease in the U.S. rig count, and that decrease in the U.S. rig count will begin to impact supply in the near term. It's really easy to increase supply over the course of a year and a half. You just increase the price. But the truth is, when you diminish productive capacity, the supply response takes longer, because the cycle involved in increasing supplies in a capital-intensive business like oil and gas takes a while.
So do you think volatility in the oil market is likely to spike now that prices have relatively stabilized?
I do think that volatility is likely to spike. I think that you will have shocks, both positive and negative, to the oil market that are associated with gradually increasing demand at the same time. Gradually increasing demand at the same time as we are seeing the possibility of major supply shocks occasioned by low energy prices and the high sustaining capital investments that the industry requires to maintain supply. So yes, I think we'll see an awful lot of energy price volatility.
One factor that could lift demand for oil and potentially lead to higher prices is a growing belief that the Chinese government will try to juice its soft economy, thus resulting in higher oil demand. So do you think this is likely?
I'm not sure how much success that the Chinese government will have goosing internal demand. But I do note that vehicle ownership in China by world standards is quite low. And you will note that for the last 2 years, the largest new vehicle market in the world was China. So I think, separate and apart from any efforts that the Chinese state may undertake, and whether or not they're successful or not, I think that organic demand in the Chinese market will be a very important factor in the market for the next 5 years, including, of course, this next year. I think it'll be the most important factor in terms of global demand.
Now, I want to talk to you about the recent preliminary deal struck between Iran and world powers over Tehran's nuclear program. So if this deal can be completed and sanctions are removed, Iran might be allowed to start exporting larger volumes of oil. So will the extra oil flow from Iran bring down prices enough to help accelerate growth in China?
I think that might happen. We believe that the Iranians are capable of producing about 400,000 barrels a day more than they're currently producing. And that would theoretically come onto a market that already has surplus capacity of between 1 million and 1.5 million barrels a day. In the near term, that could depress prices. The Iranians have an evident need for cash. Their economy is in very poor shape, partially as a consequence of their own actions, partially as a consequence of low energy prices, and possibly partially as a consequence, of course, of sanctions. And one would expect the Iranians to do whatever they could in the near term to maximize revenues, including selling all the energy that they have available on world markets.
In today's Big Deal, Aaron Aid and I are discussing airline giant Delta. The company announced that they are planning to cut back on international flights by 3% during the last 3 months of the year. Joining me live from New York to hash all of this out is Miss Aaron Aid. Aaron, what's going on here?
Hi there, Amira. That's absolutely right. Delta announced on Wednesday that they're planning to cut back on international flights to countries most hurt by the strong dollar and overall volatility in the currency and commodity markets. So the big question is, what countries are these? And obviously, we have Russia, Brazil, India. That's just to name a few. Now, they're suspending flights to Moscow altogether in the fourth quarter and cutting back on flights to Brazil. And Delta said specifically that they were targeting markets that were hit really hard by the strong dollar and the huge decline in oil price, like Brazil and like Russia. And the airline also said that they will reduce service to Japan by 15 to 20%, and the same for Africa, India, and the Middle East.
Wow, that's incredible. What's so interesting is that this comes along with the news that this was the best first quarter in the company's history from a financial perspective. Plus, most people would think that since oil prices are so low, that airliners would be doing really well. But, you know, Delta still needed to cut back on routes. So is that just a misconception?
Absolutely. You know, one would think, especially considering that Delta decided to make these changes, even though it reported $1.2 billion in profits for the first quarter of this year. So obviously Q1 was great for Delta, and they're expecting record profits in the second quarter as well. You know, in fact, Delta's CEO Richard Anderson said on Wednesday that this was the best first quarter in the company's history from a financial perspective. Unbelievable. And he also said that even though the strong dollar has been hurting international revenues for the airline, that's being offset by the more than $2 billion in fuel savings that they're expecting this year. You know, however, it seems like the company, it kind of wants to be more prudent. That's an important thing to point out because, you know, it's why they're pulling back and reducing flights to markets really hit by the strong dollar and lower oil prices. So essentially, they're just pulling back in markets where demand has been negatively impacted by declining oil prices. But notably, Amira, they're not pulling back in markets like Europe, where the strong dollar to the weaker euro is likely to increase air travel to that continent.
That's so interesting, because those are the places you would think they would be most likely to sort of pull back routes, considering that. Well, how would you characterize how the overall airline industry is doing right now?
That's a good question. And, you know, the airline industry, it's in a lot better shape these days thanks to a round of mega mergers. Shares of Southwest, JetBlue, United, American, they've all been up. And a lot of this is because the biggest airlines are no longer engaged in this fare war. That was what was driving up the, you know, basically the driving force behind many of the airlines having to file for bankruptcy. And while that's good for the airlines, sadly, it isn't great for consumers because we want them fighting to give us the best price. So someone's got to lose somewhere, and sadly, it's us. I don't own an airline.
All right. Thank you for that reporting, Erin Aid, out of our
Amira.
New York studio. Thanks so much. And that's all for now. We also love hearing from you, so please check out our Facebook page at facebook.com/boombustrt. You can also tweet at us at Erin Aid, at Edward NH, and at Amira David. From all of us here at Boom Bust, thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.
We'll be right back.